how to write a paper 1B for AICE European History. My name is Jerry Russell, and I have taught advanced placement history classes for 20 to 21 years. This is my first year teaching AICE European History, and during COVID I learned to put things on YouTube, and so I've done that with these. I have a debt to pay to a gentleman named Mr. Mello. I don't know where he teaches, but I've borrowed a lot of this from him, and he borrowed it from this other teacher who he names in his videos. But anyway, I wrote this for my students, and I am not at all sure that I'm allowed to give you any source documents from Cambridge, so I wrote my own, and I totally made everything up. I do know a lot about Russian history, or I guess, yeah, Russian history, but I made all this up nonetheless. All right, here we go. So what is the format? You're given a statement. You're asked to read 4 sources and analyze whether or not they challenge or support the statement. Now, what you do is paper 1 has 2 parts, paper A and paper B. Paper A, you're supposed to take about 30 minutes on. In paper B, you're supposed to take 45 minutes on. A lot of people, or a lot of students, almost assuredly do paper 1B first, and I'm sure a lot of them do not finish. So paper 1A is worth 15 points. Paper 1B is worth 25 points, so it's worth the most. So I'm telling my students as well to do it first. Anyway, you get 4 sources, and you analyze whether, and they give you a statement, you analyze whether or not they challenge or support the statement. And you also need to discuss the sources of the documents for reliability or bias. And this will be a 5-paragraph essay, 4 paragraphs that discuss challenge or support of the statement, and then a concluding paragraph that gives an overall evaluation. And this should take no more than 45 minutes, and I already explained the logic there. And here's kind of the format I have. 45 minutes, basically everything I told you. What you're going to do in each of your body paragraphs is you're going to do this thing called peel or P, and I'll explain that on the next page. I don't actually do the L with my students, but you're going to have a point, point, evidence, and explanation, and then you're going to do sourcing. And you can either use hippo or caps. And again, we're going to do examples of all this. You do 4 paragraphs of those. Now, I originally taught my students in my first year here of teaching AICE to do it like a AP World or AP European, both courses of which that I've taught, DBQ, where you group them all in 1 paragraph. But the teachers at my school, which had a very good pass rate last year, have advised me it's smarter just to do one document per paragraph to make sure they get all the points. Anyway, your 5th paragraph is going to be the conclusion. Overall, does it challenge or support? All right, so here we go. Here is hippo on the left and caps, which I've used for years, on the right. They're pretty much the same thing. And if you're taking notes, you might want to jot them down. And here is the peel, point, evidence, explanation, or link. And again, sometimes you'll see that I'm linking, but generally I don't do that. All right, so anyway, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the question, and we're doing B, so you can ignore A. I have another video on how to do that using the same make-believe document-based question that I made up. But anyway, there's question B. Trotsky was as important to the birth of the Soviet Union as Lenin. How far did the sources support this claim? So what I think would be smart for you to do is take a picture of this, and then I'm going to show you the 4 documents, and then you can take a picture of each of them. And if you so desire, you can go ahead and write your essay, and then can compare it to what I come up with. Either way, do whatever floats your boat. Here is document A. Again, you can pause it and take a picture. Document B, and generally they just give you a political cartoon. I've had 3 classes on Russian history. I got a little carried away with this, and I added a speech bubble. They probably won't do that, but anyway, sometimes they give you something like that. Here is document C. Again, you can pause and take a picture. Here is document D. All right, so we're going to go back, and I'm going to begin I'm going to read it to you. In the days of exile, first off, I always tell my students, read who wrote it first. So from the memoirs of Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, in 1939, She died in 1939, so let's just kind of assume she's on her deathbed or close, and she's writing her memoirs. Her husband had died many years earlier, before they were really done. I guess that was actually after he'd had control of the Soviet Union. He died, and then there was a power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky. Anyway, I'm going to read this to you. I know that's an insult to your intelligence. In the days of, we're going to try to decide, does this document support or challenge the statement that Trotsky was just as important as Lenin was? In the days of exile in Switzerland, before Lenin went back to lead the October Revolution, we lived for the party. The party was everything, and we gave our all for it. Vladimir Lenin and Lev Trotsky had split years before, and Vladimir called him the little Judas. In those years, Lenin kept the Bolsheviks alive almost single-handedly, but when they reconciled and Lev again once stood at Vladimir's side, the provisional government could not compete. Kerensky was smart and adept at cultivating the peasants, but Trotsky's leadership in the Petrograd Soviet allowed Lenin to gamble on seizing power when no one else believed they could succeed, and the gamble succeeded. The provisional government had supported staying in the Great War, and that was their fatal mistake. Lenin's genius is that he made sure that the Bolsheviks profited from that era and not the socialist revolutionaries. Okay, so I'm just going to say right off the bat, this does not put Trotsky on the same level on the stage as it does Lenin. It shows that Trotsky was valuable to Lenin, but they were not the same. So this would be a document that challenges the statement. Going on to number 2. This is Lenin, and I don't really know that this is at Finland Station where he got off the train, but this is the so-called April Theses. He came back from Switzerland, and he said, "Peace, land, bread, all power to the Soviets." I hope you know what all that stuff means. The Soviets were the workers' councils that he had decided that he could use to overthrow the Russian government. And anyway, so I'm going to point something out here. I've taught AP history for 2 decades, and on those essays, you get points for what we call outside evidence, telling them something that is not in the document. And I'm not as familiar with the AICE rubric, but I'm going to assume that you can do the same thing here. So I'm going to tell you a little something about this picture and what's going on here than what the documents state. He was in Switzerland. The Germans put him on a train, the so-called sealed car, as if he's the COVID virus inside a test tube. That was so mysterious sounding when I was in graduate school. Found out later on all that meant was the door was locked and they had guards on it. The Germans let him come through the battle lines. They actually, I think, went through the Scandinavian countries to get back into Russia. They aided him. And this was later on the provisional government, and the whites were going to say that Lenin was a German agent, which pretty much nobody believes. He was using them and they were using him. But anyway, that is not written anywhere here. It does say he had come in exile from Switzerland, but nothing about the German train. So later on, you can use that. And I tell my students, we are, of course, trained to think that prejudice is a bad word. And of course it is, but it is possible. I've been an AP world history reader. I think, I don't even know how many years, 13 to 15 years. It is certainly possible to prejudice your reader in your favor. And I frequently read an essay for AP world history and think, dang, this kid is smart. I wish he or she were in my class. And I kind of want the person grading your paper or my student's paper to think the same thing. So hopefully you will get points for knowing something that is not in the documents. So again, now let's go back to this. Trotsky's not even in the picture. So this is a challenge of the statement. Third document, Lenin was the brains and the spirit of the revolution. Trotsky was well, we got to read who said it first, right? Stalin, in his speech to Communist Party officials after Trotsky's expulsion from the Soviet Union. So Lenin was shot right about the time, right at the end of their consolidation of power, and he lived a couple of years past that. But his body weakened and he died, and then there was this tremendous power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin, and everybody thought that Trotsky would win. He was a brilliant speaker. You're going to see this in the next document. He was an intellectual giant, and Stalin appeared to be none of those things. And there was a power struggle. It's not a topic for discussion in AICE. I mean, AICE cuts off before the struggle even starts. But anyway, when you analyze this, you want to say that Stalin was Trotsky's enemy, because I do point that out in my classes. And Stalin was probably embarrassed because he does not seem to have held a central role, at least not so obviously in the public eye, in the Russian Revolution. And Trotsky did. So Trotsky's been chased out of the country. Again, you're not supposed to know this yet, but my students do know it, and I imagine your teacher taught you the same thing as well. So this is later on when Stalin is absolutely in charge, and he, of course, is going to want to downplay Trotsky's role in anything, and to do that, he's going to pump Lenin up. So this may be very biased. So let's go on and see if you can pick out the bias. Trotsky was at best a faithful sidekick, and at worst an incompetent puppet. Kerensky was a great threat, and the provisional government had the loyalty of the landowning bourgeoisie, but Lenin had a plan to overcome that NEP. It was Lenin who ordered the attacks in October, and it was Lenin who set up the details of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans, ending our part in the Great War. Of course, Trotsky was the one that delivered him to the Germans, but Lenin told Trotsky what to do. Trotsky could not have outwitted Kerensky, but Lenin made Kerensky appear dull and slow-witted. Had it not been for Lenin, the provisional government might still be in power today. So clearly, whatever you think about Stalin's widely apparent bias, this document indicates that it challenges the statement. So I hope, I wrote this, so of course I know what's going to happen next. Here there are clearly 3 documents challenging the statement. I would assume the next one is going to support it. And let's see what we got here. This is from a newspaper article in the New York Times in 1934, written by a former British ambassador to the Tsarist Russian court who spent the war years in Russia. Trotsky was everywhere during the Russian Civil War. He was on his armored train, dashing from scene to scene, battling the whites. He led the assault on the revolting sailors at Kronstadt to put down their revolt against the new revolutionary government. He seized power in the October Revolution from his position as leader of the Petrograd Soviet Military Revolutionary Committee. He was a hardened street fighter, a fiery, brilliant defender of the Bolshevik Party. His days as a Menshevik were long behind him, and he supported Lenin to the utmost. He was as central to the revolution as Lenin was. So here clearly is the lone document that supports this. And I'm going to say, as far as sourcing goes, I don't know that you were taught by your teacher what the Cold War is, but the British and the French and the Americans had armed the Russians, sent them military supplies, and as soon as the communists, the Bolsheviks, took over, there erupted this war between the Reds and the Whites. You should have learned about that. And the Western powers tried to arm the Whites, and that gave the Reds a propaganda coup. They could say, listen, why do you want to support the Whites? They're owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Americans, the British, and the French. So anyway, you're going to see me do this here in a few minutes. I'm trying to make this video kind of short for you. But I'm going to say that this guy is likely to be biased, and he's writing this for the New York Times, which is an American newspaper, the #1 American newspaper, or at least the most famous, and is probably very biased because at this point in time, the Cold War was going on, which you may or may not have learned about yet. All right. So anyway, if you were going to make a chart here, there's 3 documents challenging and 1 supporting. So I'm going to go over my paper here. Okay? So what I tell my students to do, now remember, paragraph 1 is going to start with document A. 2 is going to start with B, 3, C, 4, D. And you're going to have the very next word is going to be challenges or supports. You do not need a thesis statement. That is your thesis statement. Each paragraph starts off, your thesis statement is going to be closer to being down in the conclusion. Document A challenges the statement that Trotsky equaled Lenin in importance for the birth of the Soviet Union. So remember, I'm going to use the PEE. That is my point. And for your evidence, you need to quote the document. It does praise Trotsky, saying, Trotsky's leadership in the Petrograd Soviet allowed Lenin to gamble on seizing power when no one else believed they could succeed. I certainly missed a lot of commas when I wrote this. But clearly Trotsky is in the subordinate role, and I threw another quote in here. So this is my evidence and then my explanation. The two together could accomplish a lot, but Lenin held the party together in all the years Trotsky was not on Lenin's side. Then, I want to point out, going back up where you see the A up there, I make my students, it's a long-running AP thing that I've done, I make them circle the document numbers. It makes it easy for me to grade, and I don't know who grades the AICE essays, but I can tell you if they're working for the College Board, they're grading as fast as they can. And so I teach my students in AP classes to basically lay it all out for the reader. Show them, because we have to count all the documents that are used. In AP, you're allowed to miss one document. In AICE, I don't believe you're allowed to miss any. But so I couldn't figure out how to circle on a computer, so I just have it underlined. And then I tell my students to underline sourcing. So let's look at this. It should be taken into account that this was written by Lenin's wife years after her husband had died. He was the great leader of the Soviet Union by then, and his body was on display in Red Square. Now, that's some of that outside evidence that's not been stated anywhere, that his body was on display, but it is. She would be understandably likely to overstate his importance, but he's clearly the great founder of the USSR in her point of view. So if you remember what CAPS means, one of the P's stands for point of view. So that is point, evidence, analysis, and then sourcing. Here's the second one. Now, I don't really do sourcing on a political cartoon. You could if you knew which magazine it was in. Likewise, document B, challenges. There we go. There's the document, and there's challenges. Trotsky's importance compared to Lenin. And I talk about it. It's a picture of Lenin, the famous quote. That's my evidence. And then I throw in, and notice I have the OE there. That is the College Board coding for outside evidence. And again, I don't know who grades these Cambridge essays. I doubt there anybody who's worked for the College Board. But that is a code for when my AP kids do that, to tell the reader that your teacher is a trained College Board reader. So anyway, I don't know. You probably don't want to put the OE there, but I do it out of habit. But I'm just telling you that I'm throwing outside evidence in there to impress the reader and try to climb my way up one step higher on the rubric. He was the one leading the charge against the Russian government. This is all my explanation. Trotsky is nowhere in evidence, so this document is a direct challenge to the statement. It's there's my L right there, my linking statement. Document C challenges Trotsky's position. There we go. And there's challenges, and then here comes the quote. And I throw in Kerensky, and I mentioned that he's the head of the provisional government. Clearly supports the other two documents in challenging the statement. And here is my sourcing, and I threw some outside evidence in. Now, I tell my students, I don't know if your teacher did, that Stalin hated Trotsky so bad that he sent an assassin into Mexico. I think it was Mexico City, to kill him. But notice I mentioned here it was a speech made by Stalin to the audience. So I'm throwing those buzzwords from CAPS and Hippo to show them that I'm actually doing sourcing to get that point. Document D is the only document that supports. So there we started with document D. And here's the quote. And it's basically the mirror image of document A. And document A, they went step by step. Lenin did this, Lenin did this, Lenin did this. Document D is the reverse. It's Trotsky did this, he did this, he did this. Anyway, the writer goes down a list of important actions, pointing out his irreplaceability. It strongly disagrees with the previous three documents. And then again, here is my sourcing. And I don't know if they'll give you credit for knowing about the Cold War or not. I would think they would. But certainly if it was written in a newspaper, newspapers exist to sell copies. And I think also they would know clearly, even as early as the Russian Civil War between the Reds and the Whites, that the Americans were supporting the Whites against the Bolsheviks. And later on, they're going to become the two great rivals in the Cold War. And lastly, we're going to have my conclusion. To summarize, these documents taken as a whole do not support the statement that Trotsky was as important. And what you're going to do is you're going to go over all three documents, or all the documents that make your argument, and you're going to go in the order from strongest to weakest. I think document B was the strongest because Trotsky is not in it, and it shows Lenin on stage by himself making the point to a crowd of people that he's going to challenge the government. And so anyway, I went document B, A, and then C, and then I contrast the sourcing, okay, because I really want to get the highest point on the rubric. And then I mentioned that, and I threw in a couple other things. Before, it said that Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky all had nom de guerres. They had revolutionary nicknames. And so Lenin's real name is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. And so I mentioned his last name there, just in case. Trotsky's name was Lev Bronstein. Stalin's name is something like Yosef Vissarionovich Yugoslavia. I'm sure I butchered that. He is Georgian and not Russian. But anyway, this is my concluding paragraph. If you can do all this in 30 minutes, I think you will have done pretty well. And if you are not going, if you're watching this and you're not attending the school I teach at, I chose to leave it off this video. Maybe send me an email and let me know whether you liked it or not. I left all the comments off on YouTube because my students would just show up and say things like you're fat and you're bald, which of course are both true. But anyway, if you want to send me an email and tell me what you thought about it, I would appreciate it. All right, I hope this gave you some idea about how to do this. Remember, if your teacher taught you differently, you almost assuredly should do what they said, because I am just a first-year teacher in the AICE department.